Bonsoir à toutes et à tous, bienvenue chez Charybde. On est très heureux d'accueillir ce soir Tabish Khair et les éditions du Sonneur pour parler de ces trois romans donc, qui sont parus aux éditions du Sonneur, Apaiser la poussière, à propos d'un thug et comment lutter contre le terrorisme islamiste dans la position du missionnaire. Je vais donc parler un peu des livres et puis on va faire une interview, on va la faire en anglais. N'hésitez pas à nous dire s'il faut à certains moments qu'on traduise. Voilà, les romans de Tabish Khair, c'est des véritables bonheurs de lecture, profonds, jubilatoires, mais par contre c'est pas très facile d'en parler, parce que leur construction est à chaque fois très habile, très complexe, et ils soulèvent toujours de très nombreuses questions. Je vais commencer par parler assez rapidement de Apaiser la poussière. Donc c'est le premier roman qui date de 2004, qui a été traduit en 2010 par Blandine Longre. Les trois ont été traduits par Blandine. Et donc ce livre raconte l'histoire, tout se passe autour du trajet d'un bus qui relie en une journée deux villes, j'espère que je vais bien prononcer, Patna à Pansa, is this correct? Dans l'état du Bihar, donc en Inde. Et alors ce récit, c'est comme une mosaïque de destin et de trajectoire, le récit d'un pays en mouvement. Le livre enchaîne des chapitres extrêmement courts, et c'est comme un kaléidoscope dans lequel on peut voir les pensées, les destins de ces voyageurs, et de tout ce qui, pas seulement de ce qui se passe dans le bus, mais tout ce qui se passe autour du bus, comme si c'était une sorte de microcosme perméable. Donc on voit les passagers, le spectacle des routes et tous les incidents qui émaillent le trajet, en particulier au moment des arrêts. Donc il y a deux narrateurs. Le premier, c'est Mangal Singh, qui est donc le chauffeur du bus. C'est un écrivain raté, il a renoncé à sa vocation d'écrivain. Et il passe son temps en fait à observer ce qui se passe dans et autour du bus. D'ailleurs, il se définit à un moment lui-même comme un collectionneur d'images. Et puis il y a un deuxième narrateur qui évoque au départ la maison de son enfance et ceux qui l'habitaient, et donc le destin de personnages qu'on va recroiser parfois, comme si c'était un peu une métaphore des fondations de la mémoire et de ce qui est stable. Alors c'est toute une galerie de personnages, il y a de très nombreux personnages. Donc il y a Shankar, le contrôleur du bus, qui est un homme très pieux, mais en même temps qui n'hésite pas à vendre frauduleusement des tickets pour arrondir ses fins de mois, enfin des tickets de bus, pour arrondir ses fins de mois avec la collaboration du chauffeur. Il y a un personnage qui est un Danois aux origines indiennes, Rasmus, qui voyage, il a rendez-vous avec un ministre dans une ville, et il voyage avec une mallette remplie de cash pour aller à ce rendez-vous. Et en fait, sa voiture avec chauffeur tombe en panne, et donc à contre-cœur, il prend lui aussi ce bus, avec sa mallette. On a un jeune homme en fuite, Chotou, qui est recherché pour un vol ou un délit plus grave. Il y a une femme... personnage assez redoutable, une femme qui s'appelle Madame Mirchandani, qui est d'une classe sociale très élevée, très bien habillée, très orgueilleuse, dont on apprend qu'elle a un grand magasin à Pansa, et donc qui a une position un peu comme ça, surélevée dans le bus. Il y a avec elle, à côté, dans un groupe de femmes, Parvati, qui est un ancien eunuque, et son bordel a fermé, et donc elle tente de devenir en fait une jeune femme très convenable. Voilà, donc tous ces destins, il y en a beaucoup d'autres, et tous ces destins se dévoilent progressivement, et ils révèlent aussi la complexité des codes et des relations sociales dans la société indienne. C'est un récit où tout est en mouvement, donc il y a les passagers, et puis il y a aussi tout ce qui se passe autour du bus. Donc on aperçoit des aperçus du paysage, les champs, les villages au bord de la route, à un moment un graffiti un peu incongru qui exhorte, qui incite à lire Proust, et un commerçant donc, qui arrose le sol devant sa boutique pour apaiser la poussière, c'est-à-dire empêcher que la poussière... pendant les premières heures de la journée, ne se répandent surtout. Mais il ne faut pas se méprendre, c'est pas seulement un voyage touristique en fait, c'est surtout et aussi, ce qu'on voit dans ce livre, c'est tous les rapports de classe et de caste dans l'Inde, les interactions, les changements de trajectoire et de destin, tout ce qui bouge. Et donc c'est un portrait formidable d'un pays en pleine mutation et un portrait très saisissant de la complexité humaine. Peut-être avant de... Je pose la question en français d'abord avant de parler des autres livres. Je voulais dire qu'il y a un contexte toujours historique, social dans les livres. Et donc savoir si l'expérience de journaliste de Tabish Khair qu'il a eu au début de sa carrière l'avait influencé. So I said there is always a historical and social context in your books. And at the beginning of your career you were a journalist in Delhi. So I wanted to understand how this work as a journalist influenced these books, and particularly this one.
Do you want me to respond now?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. Okay. I ended up being a journalist by accident in some ways, just as at the moment I'm an academic in Denmark, and I kind of feel that I ended up being an academic by accident. What I always wanted to do was be a writer, but it's a difficult profession, especially if you come from a middle class kind of background. You need a decent flat, you need your glass of wine once in a while, and so on and so forth. So one has to find some other job to sustain your writing career. And for me, the first job that came my way was journalism, in India in particular, because I grew up in a very small town, in a middle class family, and in some ways I was isolated from many parts of India and from other classes. Journalism enabled me to meet people, criminals, politicians, which was good for me as a very young writer. So in that sense, I think I was interested in social, political things, but again, I mean, I would not see it as just a consequence of journalism. I think journalism was more the consequence of my interest in these matters. Because I don't think that you can be a writer without having any kind of social or political concern. It doesn't mean that you need to write political literature. But if you think of someone like, say, Marcel Proust, okay. Now, a lot of people would see him as not writing political literature, but I would see him as writing political literature too. Okay, so and that's what I mean, that you cannot really avoid writing political literature, because politics is the way people relate to one another's and structures of authority and so many other aspects of social life, and that's what a writer does. A writer basically writes about people in all their complexities, all their dilemmas, all their tensions, all their hopes and failures. In that sense, politics comes in, and I think journalism was also a consequence of that, because I wanted to meet people who were different from me. I wanted to be introduced to situations that were different from the situations I had grown up in. So the two things went together, in the sense that I think journalism was partly a consequence of what I was trying to be as a writer and as a human being. I mean, the two are again connected. Academia was also to some extent a consequence of that, because after many years of journalism, well, there were personal angles again, but by and large, I had made up my mind to leave journalism, because I felt that I had spent 7 or 8 years as a full-time journalist, and I felt that it did not give me, it provided me with lots of things I was looking for, but I felt I had exhausted them. It did not give me time to research, to think, to follow an idea through. I was always rushing around covering this politician, that case, and so on and so forth, which was good up to a certain point, but I felt that I'd reached that point. In order to develop as a human being and as a writer, I needed to have more time to think, to follow an idea, to read, to research. So again, I mean, I think all those elements have went into forming a voice, as they say it in English. So I think it was more of a holistic endeavor. It was not just journalism or academia that influenced it, but it was more my attempt to be as good a writer as I could be. And these were ways that I thought, wrongly or rightly, would enable me to be as good a writer as I could be. Yeah.
Donc, c'est évidemment un roman au titre très intriguant, parce que personne ne sait ce que c'est qu'un thug avant de lire le livre, qui est paru en 2010 et en 2012 en français. Ah, pardon. À part Marie-Thérèse.
Il y a des gens qui savent ce que c'est qu'un thug.
Et ça se prononce thug?
Thug en anglais, je crois, et en français.
In French, people used to say thug, but in English you say thug.
Yeah, I know.
It's the same word.
I still say
C'est le même mot en anglais.
I say tag
Au niveau d'écriture.
because that's the way we do it in Hindi. So it's tag.
Thug.
Yeah.
In Hindi.
Yeah. So
Okay.
but the English cannot say that. Cannot say the t sound.
Yeah.
Donc, qu'est-ce qu'un thug? Donc, dès la première page, on apprend, je cite, qu'il s'agit d'un membre d'une secte active en Inde du XIIIe au XIXe siècle, que le thugisme était une confrérie parfaitement organisée, un culte héréditaire, dont les membres étaient aussi bien musulmans qu'hindous, et qui pratiquaient le vol et le meurtre par strangulation, actes qu'ils considéraient comme des rituels religieux. Je vais essayer de parler de ce livre merveilleux, sans faire de spoiler, alors accrochez-vous. Donc, au début, il y a un narrateur qui est à Pansa, toujours dans l'état du billard, dans une demeure blanche, une demeure qui a appartenu à son grand-père, qui est disparu. Dans cette maison, il a retrouvé un certain nombre de documents dans la bibliothèque de son grand-père, et à partir de là, il raconte et il invente une histoire qui se déroule à Londres à l'époque du couronnement de la reine Victoria, c'est-à-dire 1837. Ça, c'est le narrateur. Au cœur de cette intrigue, il y a un personnage principal, Amir Ali, qui vient d'une province reculée de l'Inde, lui aussi, et qui prétend être un thug maintenant repenti. Il est arrivé à Londres avec le capitaine, une personne qui s'appelle le capitaine William Meadows, qui l'a recueilli en Inde où il était en danger et qui recueille maintenant ses confidences dans un document qui s'appelle « Note à propos d'un thug » qu'il a l'intention de publier. Mais c'est pas tout. Parmi les documents que le narrateur a retrouvés dans la maison du grand-père, il y a aussi des lettres d'amour que Amir Ali a écrit, des lettres. Il écrivait à Jenny, la servante dont il était amoureuse, mais il les écrivait en persan, alors qu'elle était anglaise. Et là, on découvre dans ces lettres qu'il déforme son histoire et en fait qu'il dit à Meadows ce qu'il a envie d'entendre, et comme ça il confirme un peu tous ses préjugés sur l'infériorité des Indiens et la barbarie des thugs. Donc tout ça, ça se déroule dans une ville de Londres, donc première moitié du 19e siècle, où on côtoie à la fois la classe, l'aristocratie toute puissante, des riches extrêmement bien pensants, et parallèlement des bas quartiers très sordides, où il y a des fumeries d'opium, de la prostitution et beaucoup de criminalité. Et à ce moment-là, donc, ce qui se passe dans ce Londres digne de Dickens, c'est qu'il y a un tueur en série qui commet des crimes et on retrouve des cadavres mutilés, tous décapités. Et évidemment, à cause de son passé, de sa peau qui n'est pas vraiment de la bonne couleur, de ses yeux qui sont sombres et qui sont forcément un peu fuyants, Amir Ali est rapidement suspecté. C'est un roman très très subtil, et là avec tout ce que je vous ai raconté, je vous ai vraiment rien dit. Parce que Tabish Khair déploie vraiment une narration polyphonique avec ce puzzle, donc de tous ces documents que le narrateur a retrouvés chez le grand-père, donc les notes à propos d'un thug du capitaine Meadows, les lettres persanes d'Amir Ali, des articles de presse de l'époque sur le tueur en série, et puis le narrateur qui assemble tout ça, qui raconte l'histoire et qui va combler certains blancs, mais pas tous, quand il manquera de traces écrites. C'est très très subtil, et comme dans tous ses autres livres, Tabish Khair réussit à dénoncer le racisme, le comportement abusif des classes dominantes, à tourner en ridicule de façon vraiment très drôle les préjugés des Anglais, de la classe dominante envers les immigrés qui arrivent de l'Empire colonial britannique. Mais c'est jamais théorique, c'est jamais manichéen, c'est toujours très drôle, c'est toujours très rusé. Et il montre justement aussi comment les immigrés déploient des trésors de ruse pour réussir à se rendre justice dans ce milieu qui est profondément cruel et injuste envers eux. Voilà, donc c'est un roman vraiment très habile, grand talent de conteur, c'est comme un millefeuille, il y a à la fois un roman historique, un roman policier, une critique sociale de la littérature, enfin du colonialisme, pardon, et comme dans tous les romans, il y a aussi un questionnement sur la littérature, sur son rôle et puis sur le rapport de la fiction et du réel. Enfin, un vrai bonheur. Donc, j'avais une question par rapport aux maisons, because the two novels start in a house, in a family house, which is like an element of stability in the novels, where the narrators have a link or where they return. So I was wondering about the role of these houses.
Yeah, sure. They appear I mean, the element that you pointed out is obviously there. Along with that, they appear in slightly different ways in the two novels. The thing about Turks, you have a kind of introduction, which is part of the novel. In some ways, I'm trying to use Victorian tropes. You'll recall that some Victorian novels would have rather lengthy forewords and introductions. But this seems to be an introduction to the novel, and it's been spoken by the narrator. But actually, it is part of the novel in the sense that that narrator is not me. And a reader who actually skips that might have trouble making sense of the ending of the novel. We can talk about that later on, because that's a different issue altogether. On the other hand, in The Bus Stopped, the house works more like a framing device, because the bus stopped, as we were told, portrays a journey from one place to another. So in the beginning you have the house, and at the end you have the house again, and in between you have this journey. So in that sense they work in slightly different ways. But I think the houses in those two novels also share the similarity that you pointed out, in the sense that they help you situate the narrator. They're not the same narrators, obviously, but they help you situate the narrator, because both the novels play on the fact that you need to know where you stand in order to get a view of what's happening. And by and large, I feel also as a writer that once you have situated the narrative voice, you can actually narrate much better. If you don't know exactly where the narrator stands, it's more difficult to actually convey the story to your readers. But of course, the narratives can be different. In these two novels, the houses seem to be very similar, and that's because I based them on houses I knew. That's again, I mean, I was reading, many of you would probably not have read much by him, but I'm a great admirer of one book by him, and I think some of his other books I feel quite interesting too. I mean, I would not reread them, but I've read them once and I have not regretted reading them. It's Stephen King, the best-selling writer. He has a book called On Writing. And that's probably the best book written by a living Anglophone writer on writing. He really had a lot of very good things to say there. I mean, it changed my view of Stephen King altogether. I used to think of him as a bestseller writer, but then I realized that actually anyone who looks at writing along those lines cannot just be a best-selling writer. There's something else there, obviously. And he talks about this too. He talks about how you have to be honest, but you don't have to be truthful. And what he means by honesty is that you have to draw upon things that mean something to you, that you relate to as well, that you can connect to, even if it's a cross. You don't have to be there, but you have to be honest in your relationship to those things. And if you don't have that honesty, then your narrative by and large fails. The reader can get that you're just pretending. You don't really care. You're not interested. And maybe that's what explains why Stephen King can captivate even someone like me, who would probably find his plots a bit exaggerated, but who will still pull into that world. And I think that's why those houses were based on my own experiences. It was my way to be honest to a certain setup. But then, of course, you take that and you change things. And that's where the fiction comes in. So I wonder whether I've answered your question, but that's how I see those two houses. In this novel, it's more of an attempt to relate to memory. And this novel is more of an attempt to actually create a slightly misleading setup because of what I want to do with the reader and to the reader. So in that sense, they're again used in different ways.
Donc puisqu'on est dans le thème misleading, je vais parler du troisième livre, qui est donc celui-ci, avec son titre merveilleux. Donc l'histoire de ce livre se situe à Arus, donc qui est la ville où Tabish Khair enseigne la littérature anglaise. C'est donc une ville importante, la deuxième ville, je crois, la plus importante du Danemark, où il y a une population étudiante et immigrée très importante, et une ville très multiculturelle. Alors le narrateur du livre, c'est un Pakistanais d'éducation musulmane qui est devenu athée, et qui lui aussi est professeur de littérature anglaise à l'université de la ville. Comme les autres, c'est jubilatoire de bout en bout et en même temps formidablement rusé. Donc au début, et ceux qui étaient là à la soirée Sophie Quedeville l'ont entendu lire le début du livre, il y a un premier chapitre qui s'appelle Prolégomène à une intrigue, et on voit le narrateur qui est en train de désespérément se masturber au volant de sa Hyundai pour tenter de récupérer un échantillon de son sperme dans un récipient de plastique pour une procréation médicalement assistée. Et ça ne fonctionne pas, d'abord parce qu'il est trop pressé, il a que 10 minutes, il doit prononcer une conférence dans 1 heure de temps, très loin. Ensuite, parce qu'il est extrêmement stressé, d'abord parce que le récipient plastique est beaucoup trop grand par rapport à ce qu'il pense pouvoir produire. Ensuite, parce qu'il voit arriver une voiture de police dans la brume matinale et il se dit mais qu'est-ce qu'on va
Qui ralentit.
Qui ralentit. Il se dit qu'est-ce que la police ne va pas manquer de penser en voyant un individu d'apparence musulmane qui est à cette heure-ci dans sa voiture en train de faire ça avec un moteur qui tourne. Donc évidemment ça ne marche pas. Et donc à la suite de cet échec et son refus de continuer à faire ça, son mariage va imploser, sa femme qui est anglaise va retourner en Angleterre. Et donc, avec son ami Ravi, qui est un indien hindouiste d'un profil très différent, c'est quelqu'un qui est issu de la grande bourgeoisie indienne, qui a beaucoup de charme, ils vont chercher une colocation ensemble, puisque Ravi a aussi des problèmes et est obligé de changer d'appartement assez souvent. Et donc, ils vont rencontrer un chauffeur de taxi un jour, Karim Bey, qui est un indien aussi, qui lui par contre est un musulman très pieux, orthodoxe, un peu dénué, sans de l'humour, et donc ils vont s'installer dans l'appartement de Karim. Alors on l'a déjà vu dans les romans précédents, Tabish Khair est vraiment très doué pour nous montrer la complexité des trajectoires et des personnalités, et donc là on a 3 protagonistes qui sont 3 immigrés qui sont pris dans leur référence culturelle d'origine et puis dans toute leur expérience de ce qu'ils ont vécu au Danemark, et qui sont aussi 3 postures différentes face à l'islam. Il y en a un, donc le narrateur, qui est un musulman pakistanais parfaitement laïcisé, Ravi, lui, qui est un hindouiste de la grande bourgeoisie, et enfin Karim, qui est un pratiquant très, très sourcilleux. Donc l'islam et hélas l'islamisme sont au cœur de ce roman, mais comme toujours, il n'y a pas du tout de discours théorique et beaucoup d'humour. Mais alors, comme d'habitude, ça n'est pas tout. C'est jamais aussi simple. Et là, je suis encore qu'au début, au prolégomène. Le narrateur, qui est assez malicieux et pas du tout fiable, il nous dit aussi comment on devrait raconter une histoire selon les canons de la théorie littéraire qu'une amie qu'il a eue lui a enseigné. Et en fait, il fait exactement l'inverse dans le roman. Donc, il nous annonce d'emblée, au fil du récit, que des événements dramatiques à forte portée médiatique vont être révélés, que cet appartement est celui qui a été mentionné dans les tabloïds lorsque la chose est arrivée, qu'il aurait dû se méfier. Et donc, par la construction de la narration elle-même, il questionne tous les préjugés qu'on a, et puis il questionne toutes les théories ou les préjugés sur la création littéraire. Donc voilà, c'est la cohabitation à la fois de ces trois Indo-Pakistanais, leurs échanges avec leurs voisins, leurs collègues, leurs histoires d'amour. Donc que ce soit les rencontres via internet ou dans les bars, ou l'histoire d'amour de Ravi avec une Danoise superbe qui s'appelle Lena. Tout ça, ça fait un roman passionnant à multiples intrigues et surtout qui questionne avec beaucoup d'humour les préjugés. Et ça soulève évidemment de très nombreuses questions. Les limites d'une société danoise et occidentale, même si la société danoise est différente, mais qui se dit très permissive et tolérante. La possibilité d'appréhender la complexité de l'autre dans un environnement très simplificateur où on est matraqué tous les jours par les médias d'images préfabriquées. Les conséquences de la peur et de la menace terroriste qu'on entend tous les jours et qui est toujours identifiée comme islamiste, qui est amplifiée en permanence par les médias. Et la difficulté ou alors l'impossibilité de ne pas être envahi par les préjugés et les idées reçues, même pour des individus multiculturels ou qui se disent tolérants ou ouverts. Voilà, donc on a un titre très provocateur qui est la première fausse piste de ce roman. Et c'est une lecture vraiment jubilatoire, très profonde, avec des questions qui résonnent très longtemps.
Là aussi, je suis d'accord.
So, one of the key features of your novel is the fact that it's I don't know if you say that pluralistic, because you have always multiple narrative voices, different styles, but also the fact that the individuals do not depend only on their individual life, but also on the collective, the collectivity they belong to. So I wanted to know the importance of that.
Sure. I think that's a very pertinent point, because for me that's quite important. That's one of the reasons why sometimes in India critics talk of my work as postmodern, and once or twice I've been asked and I've said, no, I'm not a postmodern writer. and this is one of the elements. But I've gone through postmodernism. I'm not one of those writers who dismiss postmodernism. I can see why it started, I can see what it has done, but I also feel that one needs to perhaps go beyond it to some extent. And this is, there are lots of, I can talk about this, but I won't be too academic about my own writing. And one of the elements is identity, in the sense that postmodernists and so many others believe that identities are constructs. And that is of course true, identities are constructs. But we are not free to construct things as we want them. All constructs are possible within certain bounds. These bounds keep on changing, obviously, but they are there. One way to understand that would be perhaps to take a more physical example, something like flying. Human beings have obviously wanted to fly for centuries, and if you look at our imagination, our ability to imagine flying, you can see how it has changed over the centuries. Whether it's people with wings, we call them angels or whatever, or it's some flying horse, days when people had horses, of flying chariots, and so on and so forth. And then finally we have the Wright brothers, and we have aeroplanes, very different from whatever we had imagined before that. Finally we start flying. But if we had just wanted to flap our almost wings, our hands, and fly, it would never work. So I think that's the image to bear in mind, in the sense that, okay, human beings wanted to fly because they'd seen other things flying, so obviously the human imagination, human mind is the kind of mind that has to do everything that it sees as possible or not possible. That's the way we work. I mean, it's a bit like if there's something, we need to explore it. That's one of the things that makes us human. And flying was obviously something that lots of birds were doing it. Leaves were flying around, and so on and so forth. And the notion of flying was something that struck human beings. But it could not be possible that we could just kind of start flapping our arms and fly. And I think identity is a bit similar, in the sense that certain things are possible, but they're not possible in a free manner. There are certain givens, and all identities are constructed on the basis of those givens. Some of those givens change from culture to culture. They change from period to period. An Indian constructing his identity has certain options which a Dane might not have. On the other hand, a Dane might have some options that an Indian might not have. Some options might be similar, but some options might not be there. And again, in 50 years, there will be another set of options. So for me, that is extremely important. The fact that identities are constructed, but they are not constructed out of air. They're constructed out of givens. And cultures and political situations, as well as biological elements, are those givens that we use to construct identities. I mean, a good example would be something like, for instance, certain aspects of gender identity, certain kinds of sexuality, homosexuality, for instance. You can see it as a social construct, you can see it as a biological construct. It might be both, who knows? But there are certain elements which are given, and those elements obviously shape certain people's identities. And I think that is extremely important for me, and I think in that sense I differ from certain kinds of postmodernists who sort of seem to believe that any kind of play is possible on the surface of language. I find that difficult to believe. I feel that certain kinds of play are more possible, certain kinds of play are more difficult, some kinds of play are impossible given our circumstances. They might change. It doesn't mean that it's right or wrong, it's just that that's how we are. We are as human beings, we have possibilities and we have boundaries, and we always work with those two things.
Vous voulez qu'on traduise un peu? Okay. Would you like to read a small extract in English?
I wonder whether you want me to read out something in English, because...
I would like that. Okay. I would like it in French, I would like to hear it in English. Please.
Okay, let me find something that will hold on its own. Okay, I mean, this is a very light extract, and there's no point. I mean, one of the things that I keep on pointing out when I meet readers is that I've never repeated the same novel. I mean, all my novels are different, which doesn't mean that they're different, as you highlighted without even making a point of it. There are lots of similarities. There are certain themes that cross over, plurality, for instance, and so on and so forth. But in many other ways, they're different in the sense that this is structured quite differently from this one. This is structured quite differently from the other two. I don't do it consciously, but I'm interested in different elements, also in different literary styles, and obviously when I start writing a novel, I don't see any reason to repeat myself, in the sense that if I've already done that, why should I do it again? Again, I mean, I'm lucky in the sense that I've not written a bestseller like Stephen King has. If I wrote a bestseller, I mean, last time when I wrote this, which is actually the novel that has sold most of all my novels. This one is very new. Hopefully it will sell even more, but it's just come out. But this has sold the most, and it was published by a very big American house. And then I wrote this manuscript, and I wrote to my editor, because they have first options, and that you let them know that you've got a new manuscript, and they can decide whether they want to give you an offer. And she said, "What's it about?" And I explained one-page synopsis, and she said, "Oh no, but we thought you would write another neo-Victorian thriller." And she said, but we don't want to. We want another neo-Victorian thriller from you. And I said, but why don't we just read that one? No, we don't think we can market something like that. She didn't even want to read it. And of course, it's very easy for me not to write a neo-Victorian thriller, because I had not been paid $1 million for it. But if, of course, someone paid me $1 million for it, I would probably write another one. Okay? So I'm not saying that I'm better than anyone else. It's just I haven't been offered that kind of money yet. Okay. This is a dating scene. Ravi and the narrator, who is a Pakistani, but you know about him. The narrator has just been divorced, and Ravi been dating widely, and they go to this cafe called, in Danish, under mask, in English it will be under masken, which means under the mask. Okay, I'll just read it out, about 2 pages. It was a Thursday evening, and Under Masken was already crowded when we got there. We still had half an hour to kill before our twin dates arrived. We managed to get a corner table under the usual assortment of masks and trinkets. A huge aquarium lined the wall behind us. Ravi lit a cigarette. I had smoked occasionally, at parties or on nights out, but Ravi had started smoking just a couple of years back when smoking was banned in public places in Denmark. He claimed the ban was proof of the sexist and anti-working class turn of Denmark in recent years, for it was mostly women and working class men who still smoked. He decided to oppose it by smoking at least one cigarette per day, and so far he had steadfastly adhered to his sole silent smoking protest against the ruling powers of Denmark. He offered me a cigarette from his packet of Marlboro. I declined. A rare smoker, I did not feel that the cigarette fog in the pub required any further contribution from me. The women who entered, within a minute of each other, did not look very different from their photos on the dating site. That was a relief. They also appeared to be able to identify us easily, though of course any two South Asians in any bar in Aarhus could not be too difficult to locate. Introductions over, drinks fetched by Ravi the Generous, our conversation hesitated and hiccuped like an antique car. Then it rolled down the kind of incline that I had become familiar with over the past few months of internet dating in Denmark. The initial weeks had been a surprise, though I had been forewarned by Ravi, who had been religiously dating on the internet and elsewhere since his arrival in Denmark. Between us, he liked to point out, we had experience of dating in 5 countries: India, Pakistan, though Ravi had reservations about the existence of real dating in that country, England, USA, and Switzerland. Switzerland and USA, where he had spent various periods as a student or journalist, were Ravi's contribution to the list, as was India. But Denmark, Ravi claimed, was different. It was perhaps the only country left in the Western Hemisphere where 80% of all women were afraid of dating a coloured man, and all but 1% of the rest would only date coloured men if they had a chance. A bit like England in the 1950s, this progressive country is a few decades behind the rest in some areas, Ravi insisted. At first inclined to dismiss this as predictable rhetoric from Ravi. Ravi has very strong opinions, okay? At first inclined to dismiss this as predictable rhetoric from Ravi, over the past few months I had to concede that it did contain a kernel of truth. Now, in the music-filled smoky atmosphere of Unamasken, my conversation with my date, a tall, floridly beautiful platinum blonde, who made a striking contrast to Ravi's smaller, thinner date, a woman with a hard mouth and spiky brown hair, proceeded into familiar avenues. Ravi's date, after establishing her credentials with Ravi by criticizing the Danish People's Party and its anti-immigrant politics, had proceeded, a bit surprisingly, to launch into a detailed analysis of last night's handball semi-final between Denmark and Spain, which Denmark had won after trailing in the first quarter. I knew Ravi must be squirming in the depths of his casually clad soul, as he had no interest whatsoever in any ball game. Ravi was of the opinion that the West's fascination with ball games, sadly being communicated to the rest, was susceptible to Freudian analysis, and not necessarily from the angle of the Oedipus complex. When my platinum blonde, after mentioning her love for Tolkien, which was perhaps evoked by the fact glaringly mentioned in my dating profile that I loved, read, and taught, but did not write literature, proceeded to tell me how she never dated Danish men, who were always so incredibly boring, I knocked Ravi's knee 3 times with my knee. This was one of our established signals. There was a pause. Then he tapped back 3 times. He had agreed. 2 minutes later, I excused myself went to the dingy little poster-ridden toilet on the other side of the bar and called Ravi on his mobile. He answered with alacrity. I mumbled a 1960s Bombay film song into the receiver. He replied gobbledygook in Hindi, with a few suitably intonated English words, especially hospital, 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 thrown in. When I returned from the toilet, Ravi had bad news for me. Our cousin had called. Another cousin had been hit by a car. Oh no, I said. We had to meet both the cousins at a hospital where the first cousin was rushing the second cousin. Our dates looked suitably concerned. They were nice Danish girls with nice Danish hearts. We looked suitably disappointed. We knew from experience that the fact that Ravi and I did not resemble each other in any way would not be noticeable to them. It seldom is to most people in Denmark. Families, said Ravi, the dramatist, unable to resist the temptation to improvise. That's what happens when you have large extended families. The girls nodded in sympathy. The girls nodded in sympathy. They read the newspapers and knew all about immigrants with their large families, all of them crammed into little Denmark. Some other time, I'm sure, I said, pulling Ravi away before he over-improvised.
Vous voulez qu'on lise en français ou... Non, c'est pas la peine, je pense.
We understood. Yeah.
Good. Une des questions que j'avais, c'était le côté joueur de Tabish, qui commence déjà avec les titres. So I'm saying that one of the questions I have is the way you play. First with the titles of your books. So especially these two, where you appear to be deliberately misleading us, and also because you are also writing novels which are at the same time very funny and satirical on very serious subjects, such as religious intolerance or social injustice. So I was wondering why you're playing with us like this.
No, that's a complex question. I could probably talk about it for very long, but I'll try to keep it short and answer two major aspects of that question. First of all, the use of humor, and I mean, some of it probably has to do with the kind of person a writer is, in the sense that there are two ways in which I think that laughing helps us. First of all, I mean, I do find, despite everything, most of the time I'm happy to be alive. Okay, I don't have anything to choose. Like this is all I have. No? It might not be the best of worlds, but there's nothing else as far as I know. I mean, if I were religious, maybe I would believe in some kind of paradise or something. But even if I were religious, I would not trust that there was a paradise. Who knows? And I'm not religious, so I don't even believe that there's anything apart from this. So in that sense, I think humor is part of it, like in the sense that I am sometimes genuinely happy. The other side of it is that we do live in a world where there's so many bad things happening, so many unfair things happening, that if one could not laugh at those things, one would feel tempted to shoot oneself or shoot someone else. So, in that sense, laughing helps me. Those are the two aspects there. Now, about the first part of your question, which was more about. Could you?
It was about the fact that you mislead the
yeah,
reader.
Exactly, about misleading, and that is of course connected to it in the sense that I like playing with the reader in a respectful way. I'm not making fun of the reader. Mm-hmm. I'm just assuming that the reader is willing to meet me. Mm-hmm. I think my attitude when I write is not to provide the reader with something like a piece of cake, which the reader can just eat without making any real effort. Mm-hmm. My attitude is that I'm going to walk halfway towards you, but you have to walk halfway towards me. And if you're willing to make that effort, then actually we can meet in the middle. And playing with the reader is part of that. Of course, it's also part of the fact that when you're playing with the reader, you can also make your narratives a bit more interesting, more funny, and so on and so forth. And I think, I mean, there's so many other elements there too, in the sense that I don't really like direct narratives at a philosophical level, in the sense that I don't, even when I teach, which is another matter, I hate giving answers. Even when I feel I have the answer, even when I feel that actually if I were I was running India, I would do a better job than most politicians. But even when I feel that, and I feel that quite often, I mean, which is not saying a lot, I think most of us would do a better job than most politicians. But even then, I hate the idea of providing answers, because I think that's the most deadening thing one can do. When you provide an answer, you're basically reducing the other person to the level of an infant, a child. Okay, and I don't want that. I want to make the reader think, laugh, engage with me, and draw his or her own answer. So playing again helps me do that. Again, of course, the way in which these two titles play with the reader, or the way they're quite different. I mean, the thing about that is a more of a direct play, where, I mean, one can even say that it's part of my, if I were writing an academic thesis, of my thesis statement, and my thesis statement, if I had that in mind, which I didn't when I wrote the novel, would be something like, the thing about thugs is that you can never be certain whether they are thugs. Okay? So it's the thing about thugs. So I'm playing to that extent. How to fight Islamist terror from the missionary position is I play in a different way, where, I mean, the joke is on what the reader might expect, and that of course has a lot to do with the kind of world we are living in, where certain terms come heavily loaded with significance. So, for instance, when I released this novel in India, and there was no problem at all, but there was this, I come from Muslim background, by the way, so there was this Muslim journalist who stood up and he said, I would never read a book that has Islamist and terror in the same line. And I said, in that case, you're just as prejudiced as people who think that the two. He said Islam and terror in the same line. So I said, in that case, you're just as prejudiced as people who think that they belong together. And he accepted that answer and sat down. so I'm obviously playing with those stereotypes in this novel.
And did he read the book finally?
I don't know. I didn't know him. I never heard it from him. I asked someone later who this person was, and he said, well, he's a journalist in Delhi, and he comes from a Muslim background.
So you already touched on that topic earlier, but do you consider yourself as a political writer?
Yeah, well, not a political writer in the sense that I don't set out to write political novels. But the way I think, the way I exist is political. I'm a politically conscious person. So obviously, whatever I do with the material I have ends up being political. But I don't have an agenda. I'm still interested in situations, characters, and things like that. I believe that those literary elements that drive my novels. I also believe that any novel, any work of literature, any work of art, perhaps, involves a kind of two-way relationship between the work that is being created and the person who is creating it. In the sense that a point comes when you have to listen to the work too. It's really like you have to pay attention to it. You might have started with a certain idea in mind, but at a certain point the work might resist some of your notions. And if you fail to listen to the work, you end up creating a very artificial, very stiff work of literature. But again, when I say listen to the work, it doesn't mean you listen to the work, you give up every time you meet that kind of resistance. I mean, of course, you're still trying to express what you want to express, but the work allows you to express those things in some ways. Again, it goes back to what I said about identity too, in the sense that you can only work it out in certain ways. And if you're doing it in a novel, there are certain options. If you're doing it in a poem, there are certain other options. If you want to do in a poem what you can do in a novel, then it's not going to work. You need to, even something like this, you need to make up your mind quite early, whether it's going to be a poem, whether it's going to be a play, whether it's going to be a novel. When people ask me, you write these different genres, isn't it difficult? And I've never understood that question, because I don't set out to write a novel or write a poem. It's just that I want to write about that thing in a certain way, and I feel that this I can do as a novel, this I can do as a poem, this I can do as an essay. So if that answers your question.
Yeah, you talked about the reaction of somebody in India about this book, but I wanted to ask you how it was received in Denmark.
So Denmark is a weird place when it comes to literary. So, I mean, especially someone like Denmark is a social welfare state, okay? And that's one of the things that I really like about Denmark. But one of the problems with the social welfare structure when it comes to literature and art is that it's to some extent a patronage-based structure, especially in a place like Denmark. France is much bigger. It wouldn't work in that way in France, not to the same extent. There would be elements, but it wouldn't be, because there are too many other organizations.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, it's a bit like in Denmark, everything's run by one or two bodies, okay? Which means that in some ways you have to seek the patronage of these bodies if you want to exist as a writer, which is okay for Danish writers and so on and so forth. But if you come from an immigrant background, it becomes very problematic, because a lot of these people are not equipped to judge what you're doing. They might be able to judge their own literature. And so what they expect you to do is actually approach them and pay attention to them, to play up being this needy immigrant, okay? Which I refuse to do, okay? Absolutely. So the Danish official system almost totally ignores me, okay? But then once in a while, when I get a very good review in some major American or British publication, then some paper notices that. So every time I have a novel out, Guardian gives it a rave review, or like last time when this came out, the New Republic in America gave it a rave review, and then the biggest weekly in Denmark, which has the most serious literary section, they read it, so they wanted to interview me, and I usually almost stopped doing interviews in Denmark now, because I don't feel that there's any point doing them in Denmark. This was a journalist who had made the effort to read my other books and so on and so forth. So I did an interview, and they did a very good interview. I was happy I did that. So for about 1 week, I get some interest. So every time I have a novel out, I'm discovered in Denmark. Every third year, I'm discovered in Denmark. Then they forget about me. Then I'm discovered in Denmark again. so that's the way it happens. And I think some of it, this novel in particular, doesn't really seem to get across to all Danish readers. Like I had an ex-student asking me, why did that nothing really happens in this novel? Is that because you think that Denmark is a very nice place and nothing really bad happens here? And I said, well, maybe we should just discuss it with someone else. I don't really comment on my novels. This is a student of literature, and if at the end of it she cannot really get what's happening there, then there's something wrong in the way Danes. I think as a people, they lack self-irony. That's my only explanation. I would much rather have a religious Muslim coming up to me saying, "No, you're prejudiced. Why have you used Islam and terror together?" I find that less disturbing than someone reading this novel and saying, "Oh, why did nothing really happen in this novel?" Of course, something happened, but not a big blast of the sort that she was expecting. Something obviously happened there, but and then I feel actually much more depressed. I feel, what's But of course, I mean, I have Danish friends who have loved it too, but then they're all writers.
And did you get any reaction in the US?
Yes, there were a few good reviews, but more reviews in Britain. I think my sense of humor is more British than
Oui, il y a une chose dont je parlais un peu tout à l'heure, qui est le fait que dans les romans de Tabish Khair, il y a toujours un jeu aussi sur le rôle de la littérature et le rapport entre la fiction et la réalité. So at one moment in The Thing About Thugs, Amir Ali, in one of his letters, he writes, "Are we then nothing but the playthings of language? When do we tell stories, and when do stories tell us?" So you're always playing in your novel about that border that is permeable between the fiction and reality.
Exactly. And thing about that, I was also interested in how colonial narratives have narrated the colonized, and because, for instance, I first started thinking of writing this novel when I was reading some accounts of thugs, and most of these accounts portray thugs as a cult, which means that these were people who were born into the profession, and this profession was, you know, waylaying travelers and killing them and stealing things. But the actual accounts of thugs who were tried, executed, or imprisoned by the British, as a rule, contained lines like, "My father was a petty farmer, but he lost his land, and then some people introduced me to these people, so I joined them." Or, "My father was a weaver, but then we couldn't make enough money, and so I joined these people." So evidently the British did not pay enough attention to these accounts, because it might have been a cult, but it was not that kind of a hereditary cult that they thought it was. And I can see why they thought it was a hereditary cult, because for the British, everything in India was hereditary. They felt things had been going on for centuries and centuries and centuries. And sometimes that was not the case. I mean, people in all societies used to have more traditional structures, but all societies have also changed across time. I mean, that's the way it is. The same in India. So that's, I think that was another reason why I went into that. How we tell stories, but how stories also tell us, in the sense that the story that you tell about yourself, the story that you tell about other people, also constructs a world. And once that world is constructed, you can get trapped in that world too. So it's not just that you're free to tell any kind of a story, or that or the fact that the fact that you choose a certain story to tell does not make a difference. I think it makes a very important. It's very important to choose the stories you want to tell, because the stories have a consequence. All stories are not equal in that sense.
Est-ce que vous avez des questions que vous voulez poser à Tabish Khair?
You can put your question in French if you want, and I can get an English translation, whatever you're comfortable with.
Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres projets aux éditions missionnaire?
Nous espérons, oui. Tabish est en train d'écrire un nouveau roman.
I was asking about your future projects.
It's been a bit difficult lately because there are too many other things now, back in India and Denmark and all that to tackle. But I've started working on a new novel, just about 35 pages. And I'm the only thing I'm superstitious about is talking about my work before I finish. That's the only reason. It's like I start discussing a story I'm working on. Somehow, I feel I lose the impetus to write it. So I think as long as it's bottled up, I don't even discuss stories with our common friend Sebastian Dubinsky, because we discuss a lot of things. That he loves discussing stories he's working on, and I never tell him what I'm working on. I have very broad sketch, one line, and he knows that. He knows that I'll tell him only once I've got the first draft ready.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Thank you very much. We can have a drink. Don't hesitate to continue the discussion, have books signed.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for being here.